On the world of communication.
Just from the point of view that we're trying to look here.
If you follow the educations,
we continue to use resources.
This new media,
they will start talking about corporate social responsibilities.
Not necessarily having a relation with that particular country.
We have to know our employers' self-interest.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Jonathan Crary said 24/7. Your phone is 24/7. Media is 24/7. Entertainment is 24/7. 24/7 is a time of indifference.
LSPR Communication and Business Institute is proud to announce LSPR Omni, taking learning beyond borders. Its tricolor logo reflects LSPR's infinite agility in providing a vibrant, creative, and fun learning experience at LSPR. LSPR has been and will always be the leading institute of communication and business in the region, with its offline and online learning programs. LSPR Omni will continue to provide quality education both offline and online by digitalizing all academic activities such as online classes, online training, webinars, and non-academic activities, including student services, career guidance, student guidance, and psychological consultations, as well as all student club activities in arts, sports, spiritual, humanity, and personality development programs. As the famous Greek phrase mentioned in Omnia Paratus, we proudly presents LSPR Omni, the best excellent offline and online education programs. LSPR Omni, taking learning beyond borders.
Okay, good afternoon for here in Jakarta and good morning to Prof. Mike Hardy in the UK. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Heidi Isabel and I'm from the LSPR International Office, and it's so a pleasure for us to have Prof. Mike Hardy again for our LSPR Omni sessions this year. And then first of all, I would like to say welcome to all our participants for today, our Londoners from undergraduate and also postgraduate program, and several lecturers for today. Welcome. And then also welcome to Prof. Mike Hardy from the Coventry University in the UK. And also welcome to Mr. Meka Fadilah as the respective lecturer who will be moderate the sessions for today. And before we start our session for today, I would like to kindly request for all our participants to open up their camera and mute your microphone if it's not the time for you to speak. And welcome to Mr. Mose Rizal. Welcome, sir. And then you could put your questions in the chat box. So
Good afternoon.
We will be discussing the questions and another concern in the Q&A session that will be led by our moderator, Mr. Meka Fadilah. And without any further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Fadil to take over the screen for starting today's sessions. Dear Mr. Fadil, the screen is yours.
Hello, thank you, Ms. Isabel. It's really nice to see you. And hello, good afternoon from Professor Mike Hardy or Professor Hardy. Wish you're doing good there.
It's great. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, perfect. And thank you also for all ladies and gentlemen that have attended this forum discussion today. Thank you, we really appreciate it. And also for the students of Entrepreneurship Program Management from LSPR and any other faculty also, we would like to appreciate for your attendance. And for this noon, we will have a good, lovely discussion with Professor Hardy, who is Director of the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations from Coventry University, UK, and Chairman of International Leaders Association. Thank you. And today we will discuss the topic is about entrepreneurship, management, and leadership. Before we going further, okay. Technical. Okay. Should I repeat?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So before we start,
maybe I would like to invite and please Professor Hardy to give an opening statement for all participants in this forum. Please, Professor Hardy.
Thank you so much. And can you see my PowerPoint?
Perfect.
Slide? Good.
Yes, we can.
So, and good evening to all of you. It's always a great pleasure to come to the Communication and Business Institute and talk through some of the areas of research that I'm currently involved with. It's always a pleasure, but of course it's disappointing that I'm not physically there with you. Time will allow us, I'm sure, to allow me to visit. At the moment, it's very difficult. But I've got quite a challenge to talk to you this afternoon about entrepreneurship, leadership, and management. And I'm focusing my talks on this issue of what I call navigating through complexity for change. Most of you are interested, and I've seen your curriculum so far. You're interested in the challenges faced by leaders in the contemporary age. And I'm certainly going to focus on the trends and issues which we can observe are making life quite challenging and very difficult for leaders, both in the private sector, in the not-for-profit sector, as well as in the political domain. So I'm going to look at trends and issues in this, what I call the 21st year of the 21st century. I'm going to look at how organizations can behave and respond. And I'm going to focus a lot on my interest in trust, and trust in the relationship between people is a critical part of successful and effective leadership. So setting our agenda. If I'm not clear at all, then put a note in the chat. If you want me to come back to any issue, I can. And my slides, all my slides are available to you all, and I've sent them all already. But in our agenda, I'm going to ask that we think about the need for clarity and for shared understanding about the topics that we're discussing. The three big issues for me, which do create a lot of interest in the contemporary world, is the relationship between authority and leadership. Who has the ability to impose a view or impose leadership on a particular challenge? Quite often in the corporate sector, this of course is the chief executive, the managing director, who has the authority of the board of shareholders, and employees have a contractual relationship with the boss to follow instructions. As we'll see as we unfold this conversation, it's not as straightforward as that. And top-down leadership tends not to be as successful in the modern age as one which allows more participation and more conversation and dialogue around decisions. So I'm going to talk not just about leaders, but about leadership. And this is a really important distinction, that the leadership is a process by which we mobilize and point in certain directions, whereas the leader tends to put down to personalities and individuals. So you'll see when you look at your reference material, you're reading more widely on leading and leadership, that there's a difference between the traits of a leader, the personal characteristics of a leader, and the success or otherwise and process of leadership. And this often comes down to the purpose and role of leaders and leadership. And I'll make some reference in our journey between leaders and leadership that addresses technical problems and solves technical problems. Many authors argue that leadership is all about problem solving. And my own preference from the research of many now are looking at leadership, how you navigate particular adaptive challenge, how you make adjustments and continuous adaptation to the nature of the modern world. And I'll unfold this as we proceed. My starting point and point of advice to you all is make sure you ask questions. You learn more by asking questions than you do by providing answers. And you'll find it maybe frustrating that in my talk this evening, I'm going to be asking more questions than I'm going to be giving answers. And that's because by challenging and questioning, by raising issues, we learn more. So I'm going to do 5 things very briefly in about 30 minutes. I'm going to look at the issues and trends through the lens of what I call new and unsettled times. We live in a world in 21st century, which is very new and very uncommon, very uncertain, very difficult to describe, what I call the changing context. And I'm going to highlight what these changes are for you to think about. Secondly, I'm going to look at reimagining the role of leadership and its approach to resolving some of this change context. I'm going to look at 8 destinations, as I call them, following research for the 8 questions we can ask leaders and the 8 things that will lead to better leadership. And I'm going to finish by looking at why leaders emerge at all, and we can understand better their successful approach, and look at the issues of trust and social capital. So let's make a start. Leadership is really important. Leadership matters. Better leadership is a critical factor for human flourishing, for us all to be better off, whether that's for better and more effective organizations, more effective communities, more effective nation states, or indeed for a more effective globe. Many of our world leaders are meeting here in the UK next week in Glasgow in Scotland for the climate conversations of COP26. If they're not effective, we all suffer. So leadership at all levels matters. But leadership is just as important in your own households or your own neighborhoods. With better leadership, societies can begin to address many of the contemporary business and societal challenges. Often, however, we see more evidence of bad leadership than we do good leadership. So in my short talk this evening, I'm going to be looking at what pointers might we look for more effective leadership, and how as individuals can we become better contributors to more effective leadership in today's world. So let me first of all look at the current challenges. This is a lovely cartoon of jellies, because jellies are very wobbly and very unstable. But the 21st year of our 21st century, 2021, we know is a really challenging time. And I let aside the challenge of the pandemic and coronavirus 19. Clearly, COVID-19 is a major destabilizing force, but the world was becoming quite unstable anyway. Let's look at the 5 issues which I think characterize the current trends and which effective leadership has to address. The first is, it's a very famous German sociologist called Hermann Rosser, who writes about what he calls the accelerating changes, the pace of change, probably more important than the change itself. So we live in an era now where change takes place very rapidly and where we have an unyielding and accelerating pace of change. So things happen so quickly. And this requires a leadership that's agile and able to react just as quickly. By the time you solve yesterday's problem, tomorrow's problem comes along, and it's very different and new and challenging. Secondly, we have changes in power relationships, which are unprecedented, whether these are because of big changes in climate, in migration, big changes in political relationships, the emergence of the new China, the new newly empowered economy, the demise of other economies, or the withdrawal from the international community of some. We know that at national levels, we have a huge and unprecedented change in power relations. But this is also the case in local levels, local organizations, local communities. Power matters, and it changes quite quickly. Thirdly, we live in an age of huge technological change, so rapid. The changes in the last 6 months are probably greater than the changes of the preceding 50 years. That's how much it's changing and how changing is taking place so quickly. The digital technology particularly connects us all. in ways that we didn't anticipate before. And that brings huge benefit through globalization, through the sharing of resources, the sharing of knowledge, but also great vulnerabilities and risks, as we've seen by cyber attacks and by the abuse and misinformation that follow the digital revolution. So technologies don't only support us, they also disrupt and challenge us. We're also in an age where global power has been unhitched from responsibility. So those with power at a global level, the big tech giants, the big energy companies, those who most affect the health of our climate, they're not always the ones that retain responsibility and live up to the responsibility that that power brings us. And the final change is we live in a big era now where the big debate is between accountability, who's responsible, and impunity, when many people are able to take decisions but never step up and face up to the consequences of their decisions. So these are quite high level, but hugely significant changes. The acceleration of change, power relations, technology, responsibility, and impunity. So this is a time also when we have very new and distinctive interconnections. And there are three conclusions from research into leadership, which helps us through this. Three things that are really important. In Davos at the World Economic Forum earlier this year, a virtual Davos this year, and this is when world leading corporations and politicians come together to review the challenges of the 21st century and to look at what the big agenda items should be. Three conclusions they came to this year, which I thought I'd share with you. This is really interesting. First is that the big corporates and politicians are saying that whatever we do in this changing and uncertain time, we must put people at the heart of our collaborations. So this is a people-centered world, not a corporate-centered world or a government-centered world. It's about us as individuals, our families, our communities, bottom up. And the world leaders are saying that the urgency with which we must face the changes put people at the heart of our collaborations. Secondly, it's very clear to us, and the pandemic has helped us understand this better, of ensuring multilateral frameworks work for everyone. So there's very little we can resolve against the challenging context that we have by looking at individual nations or individual cities or individual neighborhoods. We're all connected. And it's the multilateral frameworks of supranational discussions that are important, just like the COP26, which is taking place next week in Glasgow. Without a unilateral, an international view, a transnational, supranational view of climate, we won't be able to resolve the challenges facing us from global warming, just as we are not able to resolve the pandemic of COVID-19 without international action. And the final conclusion they came to at Davos was that there's an ongoing struggle to preserve our democratic participation. This is like a full circle. If we put people at the heart of a collaborative world, we need a democratic mechanism to allow the voice of people to be shared. So what kind of leadership can help when there are no easy solutions? Sometimes the sharpest way of understanding effective leadership is to look at its most challenging context. Critical skill for anyone looking at systemic changes in an increasingly complex world are to look at the expectations we have of leaders. And I would argue that probably the most important ingredient of effectiveness is what leaders and leadership does about trust. Whether we trust each other, even if we don't understand, we don't like each other, we don't agree with each other, can we trust each other in a process which can resolve some of these large contextual problems? So the research that has been done on more trusted leaders shows some qualities that trusted leaders have. Vice versa, of course, this shows the qualities that leaders that are not trusted tend not to have. So the four big qualities that we expect to see in the more trusted leaders within our processes are very interesting. The first is that those leaders and leadership processes that cultivate a diversity of viewpoints in order to generate a large number of options for facing the challenges moving forward are more likely to be trusted. So those leaders that you know who ask for views, who want to find out what your thoughts are, want to collect different and diverse views are more likely to be trusted. Those leaders, secondly, that lead with empathy, that think about the consequence of their leadership on you and on other people. Thirdly, it's very interesting that those leaders who are more trusted tend to reward their employees or their colleagues' performance with autonomy. Though the better and more effective you are in your workplace, the more responsibility you're given. When that's the case, leadership tends to be more trusted. And finally, the leaders that look to try and create winning solutions for all the stakeholders, not just for themselves or for their group, are more likely to be trusted too. So I've got a couple of slides here, which are my sort of 8 steps from the research. Don't worry about following them all in the level of detail that I have them on the screen. You'll get a copy of the slides. But there are 8 characteristics of trust in the 21st century, which is showing to be very effective in helping us improve leadership generally. Firstly, do leaders ask the right questions? It's normally assumed that leaders and stakeholders know the right questions. When change takes place, however, very rapidly, sometimes we don't know the best question to ask. So let's have a leadership process which allows people to explore the questions, not simply ask them. And asking the right questions is the key to acquiring the right knowledge about current challenges. Can leaders, secondly, deal with complexity? Leaders need to work creatively, but we have a very complex system. Complexity is a really interesting space between stability on the one hand and chaos on the other. We have a stable place, or do we have a chaotic place? Well, we have neither. We have this gray intermediate place, which we call complexity, where we solve one problem and create another, where we have interconnections and interdependencies, which are very, very challenging. Do the leaders, we've already mentioned, thirdly, do they cultivate trust? Do they deliberately work out how they can build positive relationships between all stakeholders? And because things are changing so quickly, how agile are leaders? How adaptable are they to contemporary change? My 5th point is, do leaders engage with the whole? Or do they just look at their own personal, private, and very short-term interests? The best leaders take a view of the whole issue, all stakeholders, even those who are less or tangentially related to their current interests. How well do they manage loss? Really interesting. Most decisions involve winners and losers. How much attention do leaders place on those who lose, on those who are suffering, left behind?
Okay, it seems like a connection with Professor Hardy. Okay, could you please, International Office, assist us for this, Miss Heidi?
Yes, Mr. So we are waiting for Prof. Mike to log in any soon because of the connectivity. Maybe if there's any questions or discussions that maybe from Mr. Fadil or Mr. Mose want to encourage the students to ask question or discussion from the Prof. Mike presentations.
yeah, it was unfortunate that Mr. Mike Hardy we lost connection. Yeah. Okay. So, is there any question from our students? Yeah. Okay.
Okay. For everyone who can ask, remember that this session also will give additional marks, right? As a result.
Exactly. Yes. Actually, the most active will be more active, more marks.
Definitely.
It will be considered as a coursework point. So.
Okay. So it's really interesting that we by things that we presentation from Professor Hardy about the leadership and entrepreneurship. Well, I believe that actually are still plenty of information that he wants to deliver for us, but by far, for all students who want to make a question, please, we are here, that maybe we can make a discussion while waiting Professor Hardy. Stay tuned again. Or what if we that ask the question for the students? Okay, while waiting for the Professor Hardy, okay, so I have a question about the last slide. Okay, for the students who can answer this, they will be get additional marks for sure from the lecture. Okay, at the last slide, Professor Hardy was saying that the most trusted leaders showing 4 evidence, like cultivate diversity, lead with empathy, reward employees, and find win-win solution for all stakeholders. Okay, so here is the question for all students. How that important that a trusted leader can show this 4 evidence? For what? Okay, is there anyone can change? Most trusted leaders can show this 4 evidence, but why is leaders must have this 4 evidence? Professor Hardy was there.
Okay.
Okay, ready to start again, Professor Hardy?
I hope so. I apologize.
Okay.
I had it
Welcome
seems
back.
Okay, welcome back.
There was a power outing. I'm really sorry.
Fine. Okay,
So
please. Okay, for the question for students, we can hold later. Yeah. Okay, we let the Professor Hardy to continue the presentation. Please, Professor Hardy, we welcome you.
Yeah. No. Sorry, I'm trying to get my slide back.
Yeah. We will keep the question. We have a few questions from the students, but we will keep the questions after you finish your presentation.
Can you see the slides now?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
Yeah.
I've had to change machines. I'm very sorry about this. I do apologize.
Never mind, sir.
Prof. Mike, maybe if you want us to help you too. Oh, there's your screen.
There
I'm on a different computer now. I apologize. I had a real panic. So my sincere apologies. But so we were looking, I think we've got the right one. At yeah, we were looking at what helps us trust leaders in the 21st century, and we looked at the first 4 points, and we were looking now at whether or not they engage with the whole, how well they manage loss, and the 7th and 8th. We've caught up again to where I was. I do apologize. The 7th and 8th relate to whether or not leaders relate to both the local and the global, And finally, how much they invest in continuous and self-learning. So those 8 are really interesting, and they're on the slides that you'll get. So have a think about my descriptions. So essentially, do leaders ask the right questions? Do they deal with complexity? Do they cultivate trust? Are they agile and adaptable? Are they engaging with the whole? Do they manage loss? Do they relate both globally and locally? And do they invest in continuous and self-learning? So the big trends then are as I described, and they're really hard for leadership to be effective. And that's why quite often we see more examples of bad leadership than we do of good leadership. But the big issues, I think, and the big questions that you need to continue to ask in your review is, why is it that so many leaders in positions of authority fail to lead? And how is it that authority can get in the way of leadership? Sometimes when authority is centralized into really effective or dominant leaders, we see it getting in the way of good leadership. We need also to look at how people can lead without having authority. This isn't a conundrum. This is actually a very often observed state. People can lead from any position. And in fact, leadership takes place at all levels within organization. Definitions matter. And so I'd suggest to you that my definition of leadership is on this particular slide. It's not about an individual you're interesting. The leadership that's more likely to bring sustaining outcomes from our research is the leadership that mobilizes people to accomplish adaptive change. So leadership is a practice. It's not a person. It takes place with and without authority. It builds new capacity in people, and it's focused very much on building the ability of others to do work. It meets adaptive challenges, and it promotes thriving in a changing and challenging world. So leadership in this definition is a very positive thing. It's a very enabling thing. It mobilizes other people in a very positive way. So if it's about mobilizing people, this for me is the best summary of all. What does leadership do? It does 2 things. Firstly, it works to make sense of complexity. Measure your leadership by how successful it is at making sense of what's going on, making sense of the world in which we live. And secondly, it helps to make positive change. So those 2 things, leadership that's successful helps make sense, works to make sense, and helps to make positive change. So what are the issues arising from the trends that I've described? Firstly, that the sort of challenges that we've observed in the contemporary world, whether they're the major problems of climate or health, whether they're problems of financial downturn or complexities of international trade, require completely new thinking, require leadership that is quite willing to throw old models out of the window and consider new thinking. To make real transformation is not just innovative, it's also quite conservative. It requires you to build the future with new ideas, but not forget the experience and the expressions of the past. But innovation means experimenting. How many of our leaders and leaderships are willing to take risks by trying new things, by experimentation? And how many of the leaders are really investing in learning about the environment in which they operate, the context in which they make decisions? I've learned so much by observing how different government authorities have reacted to this recent and current pandemic, how often have they reviewed the sciences, looked at the nature of human behavior, and made the decisions that they need to on that basis? And general success, as I said earlier, requires local adaptations to local environments, not global supranational attention, but very local adaptations and local experience. Next, people with the problem are part of the solution. If we have a problem of behavior or a market of consumers or workers that aren't working hard enough, whatever the problem is, it's the people with the problem that are part of the solution. And adaptive solutions often lie then within the organization and society that they take place. We said also that the issues about managing losses are critical. Solutions involve losses, material losses, competence losses, identity losses. And we need to manage these losses, but in order to manage them, we have to identify them. And adaptive work generates disequilibrium. So leadership that's effective and managing the complexity I've referred to creates uncertainty and unsettled times. And it's those losses that generate resistance. When leaders change direction, it creates unstable times, uncommon times, and that's when members of the team and stakeholders and the general public generate resistance because they don't like change. They don't like the less than predictable decisions that leaders should be taking in their view. Making adaptations to this complexity takes much more time than technical problem solving. If you have a problem that you can solve, that's straightforward. But taking an organization and learning and adjusting and adapting to change is much more time consuming and very difficult to do successfully. So what really matters when it comes to leadership trends and issues? Firstly, leadership, as I've expressed to you, really matters a lot. But relationships are important in the way we've described what leadership is. If your focus is on mobilizing other people to solve problems, other people to adapt to the challenges, then relationships are critical. And the way in which you encourage them to work and to collaborate is clearly important. And connections matter. The way in which we connect one to another. So finally, in the area of research we're doing on how leadership has to change for the 21st century, we've got a number of issues that are important. Some of these are quite surprising. Firstly, there's no doubt at all that all the literature suggests, and have a look at this, that effective leadership in the 21st century requires a non-negotiable commitment to ethical approaches, to fairness and integrity, to transparency, to honesty, to openness. There's no mystery here. It's not just because ethical approaches are the right way to do things. The evidence shows that they're more effective and more successful. Why? Because they develop less resistance to change. Secondly, effective leadership in the 21st century is inclusive and represents all stakeholders, not just a few. It has the ability to listen, importantly, to hear and to reflect on the conversations that it takes place. The other research which surprised me, I have to say, is that effective leadership should be responsive to multi-generational solidarity. This is quite innovative in thinking, but it means that the old and young in our populations are as important at the same time. How often do we hear about the next generation? Let's push the young leaders of tomorrow into tomorrow. They will take responsibility, whereas the older and experienced ones will lead now. Well, the evidence is clear that you need both experience and innovation, that you need a multi-generational approach. And I've already made the point about defining our leadership by the questions we ask, not by the answers that we give. And when you look at any leadership that you're exploring or reviewing or evaluating, whether it's the leadership at the United Nations level, at the level of your nation, Indonesia, when you're looking at the leadership of your city or your company, measure them against these 5 issues. Are they ethical? Are they open and transparent? Are they inclusive? Do they represent all stakeholders or just a few, an elite? Do they listen? Do they hear the issues that are raised by members of the organization? Do they look at both and at the same time to the old and the young? And do they ask questions rather than suggest that they always have the right answers? The things that research can't help us with, we're still working as in the academy, and business leaders and political leaders are working, are these 4. We still are troubled by complexity. We're still not equipped to cope with all the adaptive systems that are created. So, for example, in the management of climate, it's very easy to solve the problem of carbon footprints by requiring the rainforest to be protected, by stopping the use of coal-fired electrical generation, by restricting the use of motor cars. It's by flying less around the world. All these things are very straightforward, but we know if we were to stop people flying around the world, or if we were to stop people to use the rainforest for resources, it would cause huge dislocations in terms of communications, prosperity, people's jobs would go. So we're still wrestling with how to deal with this complexity. And I think the solution here is about priorities. It's about which is the more important. And these require very complex leadership processes to discuss openly with people. Should we really ban cars unless they're clean? What would happen to the economy if we did? Then there's the question I referred to earlier about power and who has it and how we distribute it and how we manage it. There's the question about an approach to decision-making that's based on solutions. And there's the question about empathy and compassion. Our moderator was asking the question when I had my power shortage, my crisis, about empathy and about how we would develop more empathetic leadership than perhaps we have. How do you get more caring people to understand the perspective that you have as an individual? I'm going to finish with 2 models just to tease you with some thinking, the way I'm currently working on our research here at Coventry. And this relates to political leadership. This particular one asks the question, why do leaders emerge anyway? Where do leaders come from? What drives, what's the passion, what's the interest in leaders? Most leadership in political sense are unhappy and want change to take place. They want a better world for their populations, a better world for their voters. But it's very interesting to see that not all leaders emerge in the same way. This can also be applied to corporates and to the private sector. On my horizontal axis, I've got a spectrum of outcomes from anything is better than the state we have now, right through to those who have a clear agenda for the vision of the future. If you think of Indonesia in this sense, when a presidential candidate puts himself or herself forward, do they say that I want to change the world, I want to get it better, but anything's better than the state we're in now? Or do they set out a clear agenda and a vision? We have experience of both. And on the vertical axis, we have those leaders who want to build a future and those who simply want to destroy the way things are. Very binary. And you'll see the different cases that creates. So those leaders who want to build something, but they don't mind what it is, are in the top left-hand quadrant here. They will replace one challenge with another. In the English language, we talk about jumping from the frying pan into the fire. Both are hot places. Those leaders who want anything rather than now and want to destroy everything to start with, we've seen before. We've seen those who want to dismantle the existing order and expect that anything that will come from this order will be better. Clearly, that's quite a destructive and negative thing, but there are plenty of leaders we could point to in our history that do just that. I'm much more interested in the blue area in the top right quadrant, which actually is about having a clear vision for the future and wanting to build. So this is what drives this leadership. It's the most successful model, of course, but the most difficult. And its interest is how to change, how to encourage the best practice, how to mobilize people in that direction. Most of the others are about tearing down without a clear vision for the future. So the top right-hand quadrant is the leadership direction that we should be working on. And the question you must ask is, how do we encourage that type of leadership? How do we empower leaders that want to build with a clear agenda? The final bit of analysis, I said that leadership is all about relationships. And this is a comparison or an interface between different types of trust. One of the observations I made earlier was how much trust has declined in recent years. And this is trust not only on the horizontal axis here, is between people, between individuals. We have very low trust where there's outgroups, whether that's you don't trust someone with a different ethnicity, a different nationality, different language, comes from a different place, to high levels of trust on the right-hand side, what we call in-group behavior, where people are very similar to you, and you have a high level of trust because you have an in-group relationship. Clearly, there's a spectrum of areas here. The biggest problem we face globally is how we can build trust with people that we don't know very well and that are very different from us, the outgroups. Less of a problem is how you build trust with the in-group, your own neighborhood, your own community, much easier. But there's another kind of trust that's important for leadership as well, and it's what I've called here the vertical. The vertical axis is between individuals and structures and institutions. So the individual and the state, the individual employee and the organization. So here you run a spectrum from those that feel very left out at the bottom, excluded and marginalized, and those that feel very valued and engaged. What happens in Indonesia, where you have communities that feels that the government just doesn't think about them, ignores them, and leaves them out, as opposed to those who feel very valued and very engaged? And the same applies, of course, also in organizations. If your employer doesn't value you, excludes you, doesn't include you in decision-making, or values you. So we have a combination here of trust between individuals, from low trust to high trust, and a trust between individuals and institutions, low trust and high trust. At times of challenge, we tend to find people withdraw, trust diminishes and reduces between individuals, and also people find less trust in organizations, be they banks, be they big corporations, be they governments. And that puts us down into this area of low trust and being excluded, which I refer to as a top-down place where you have very divisive leadership. And clearly, we want to be pushing into the yellow box. We want to be pushing to a form of leadership which builds on trust between people and increases trust with institutions, high levels of participation and engagement. So the question we have is, how do you get a leadership, again, that pushes us into that top right-hand quadrant? So there are two bits of analysis for you to just reflect on. The question you have is, how do we do it? How do we get leadership that builds with a clear vision for the future and that includes people and relies more heavily on trust? So in my presentation, which was sadly disturbed in the middle, I do apologize. I don't know what happened. I've looked at 5 issues. I've looked at the new and unsettled times that we're in, this changing context for leadership. I've looked at leadership and how we define it and its role, and I've looked at 8 ways of improving leadership. And this applies at community, at corporate level, as well as government and supranational level. I've looked at research that I'm currently doing on why leaders who want to move forward in a positive way or who just want to turn their back on the past. And I've looked at the interface between trust and social capital. And I hope you found that interesting. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Professor Hadi, for your explanation. It's really interesting. Yeah, I hope the students will get a very insightful information from this presentation. Okay, can we begin for the question? Professor Hardy, we have a few questions from students in here. Okay, let me read it for you. The first question is coming from our student who named Kartika. She asked, do you have any examples what we can do for a better leadership during this pandemic?
So, Kartika, how are you? Thank you for your question. That's of course, everybody's asking all the time because we're so concerned about the negative impact of the pandemic. But I think pointing to the ideas that I raised, there are 2 or 3 things that need to happen. One is that we need to have leadership that is inclusive and that draws on the opinions and views of experts. So we have a saying that science should lead our decision-making, not politics. So the best governments, those who've been most effective at managing the pandemic, have tended to be those with 2 characteristics. One is they've listened to the scientists. Even the scientists, of course, disagree, so you need to listen to lots of scientists and come to a political judgment. But the second are those that haven't been afraid to adapt and change direction when the evidence changes. So some governments have been very stuck, have made a decision and moved forward on that basis, even though the context has changed. So we need agile decision makers, we need informed decision makers, and we need humble decision makers who say, I'm sorry, I got this wrong the first time, I'm going to get it right the second time. And I think that the more inclusive leadership with integrity we have, the more likely we are to get through this terrible pandemic. I have to tell you that our government, I've had many criticisms of our government in the United Kingdom for being too focused, too late, making decisions very much later than they should have done, not always listening, and sometimes more concerned about the damage to the economy than the damage to people. That's my private view, of course, and they would argue differently. They would say, well, it's very difficult. We've never confronted challenges such as this before, which of course is right. So governments and leaders who face new challenges with no experience have to experiment, but they have to resort to some of the qualities I've listed on my slides. Thinking long term, ability to change direction when you hear good evidence, and listening to different expertise and different options for change.
Okay, thank you, Professor Hadi. So by the summary is we need to listen for the expertise, for the scientists, and we have to have a willing to adapt, right? Before finally make a decision. As a more trusted leaders, you were saying we have to find the solutions for all, win-win solution for all stakeholders. Yeah, correct. Okay, we are going to the second question that coming from Kirti Sharma. Kirti Sharma, he or she is a student from a postgraduate student in LSPR in business communication major. She asks you about your opinion about leadership. Does it comes from passion, or is there anything else that actually coming beyond passion to have a good leadership? Please advise.
That's a really good question, and I have to say, yes, I think leadership and leaders emerge when they want to see change. Normally, they want to make a difference. They want to make a contribution. Now, in the corporate world, the contribution is to running effectively a company and serving the needs of shareholders and the needs of customers. And I think you're right to highlight that passion is really important. And leadership isn't a technical thing. It's something that combines head and heart. And the best leaders that I've observed in my research have been those that do both. Just heart alone isn't enough. You must also be reflective of the impact of your decisions on other people and the consequences of your actions. But most people who are driven by passion equip themselves with rational thinking in order to have best effect. That magical combination between head and heart, I think, is important.
Head and heart.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your answer. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Kirti, for your question, and also Professor Hardy for your explanation. Again, the first comes about the leadership is very important, how to combine our heart and heart, as Professor Hardy were saying. Okay, we have another 2 questions. Still okay?
That's fine, yeah. I'm reading from the chat. Would that be quicker? So I'm looking at Hitomi, an undergraduate student majoring in international relations. You're going to ask about the several types of leadership. The types of leadership that I referred to and leadership style. You know, I didn't spend much time on this because I'm not a great believer in focusing on leaders, whether I'm a bossy leader or a very kind leader, whether I'm informed, whether I'm big-headed or humble. At the end of the day, the most effective study is of leadership, of the role that a combination of stakeholders have. But regarding that, I think that the most effective leadership that I've seen is characterized by some of the points I've made. It's inclusive, it listens, it adapts, it's reflective of the whole, rather than being driven by a personal agenda. You know, sometimes we observe very, very successful leaders who seem to be totally dominant, very forceful, very assertive. They don't survive forever. You know, the most sustaining leadership is that which empowers other people, respects teams and collaborations. Gosh, we got some very good questions coming up. And there's a question also from, is it Yuvani, about leadership in a family business, where you're absolutely right. Usually there's a worrying family businesses that there's a lack of professionalism. I think that's your question. And I think it's a really, really good question. Very difficult when you have families involved in business. And why is it difficult? Because I think you tend to bring the same hierarchy to your business as you do to your family. So what do we mean by that? Well, in the social structure of a family, particularly in our contemporary cultures, they're male driven by the patriarch, by the oldest male, and that may be exactly disastrous for running a business. So the reason that family businesses struggle sometimes is they take the same relationship model from the family and apply it to the business. I'd always encourage you to think separately. Sometimes, you know, particularly with multi-generational competence, sometimes you have to let the family business be run by the most effective member of the family, not just by the most senior, if you follow me. I think the other thing is that families are social structures. They're about relationships, about nurturing your children, raising them. That's not necessarily the best set of skills for running a business, which needs to look sometimes at very difficult relationships and not ones that are entirely based on loving nurturing of family members. It relates back, doesn't it, to the point we made a bit ago, head and heart. Most families are run from the heart. Most businesses need a little bit more head in the balance. So Brasto Gali Nugroho from Corporate Communications of Blended Learning Batch team, you're interested in trusted leadership, and who do you think have been implemented the best leadership during COVID-19 pandemic? Really, really difficult question. But let's leave the UK and Indonesia aside so that we don't get into hot water and trouble. We've seen some really good different types of leadership and to different effects. If you look at the United States started with a chaotic leadership, no clear structure, no ability to talk to the whole population. So some parts of the United States have fared very well, in California, in New England. Other parts in the South have been quite resistant to central government and anti-vaccine, and we see that difference. So there, you'd say that there isn't a good model of trusted leadership in the United States at the United States level. There is very strong trusted leadership at very local levels. I think the other two countries in your region which have fared very well have been Taiwan and New Zealand, for different reasons. In Taiwan, you have very strong compliance, very clear government leadership. In New Zealand, you have a very small country where you could protect people. In Hong Kong, much better management in Hong Kong than many other countries because it closed itself. It was able to isolate and it was very decisive. So we learn, I suppose, a little bit from observing the differences of the types of leadership that work really well. And the leadership that was clear, decisive, and tended to focus on fighting the spread of the transmission has been the most successful. Those that were less able to mobilize in that way have been less successful. Clearly in China, they've had a lot of success, but they have much more control in the way in which they managed the pandemic. Much less freedom of individuals to resist, very much control from top down. Different models have had different impacts and different success.
Professor Hardy, I have a question from my students. It was sent to me directly, so maybe I can read it for you.
Thank you, Moshe.
Okay, I have my student Novia Kalista. Yeah, she has a question: how to be a responsible leadership, as explained before. Yeah.
So I like this question of responsibility. I think it's hugely important because we live in an age where responsibility sometimes is lacking, where people don't step up and accept that they are making a decision which they must be accountable for. So I put this in the same conversation as accountability. So I think responsibility is about how collective you are in your decision, how open you are to sharing and discussing with other stakeholders. So responsibility is not about going and becoming an individual leader that doesn't listen or talk to anyone, but a leader that engages in most dialogue with all other stakeholders is the one that becomes the most responsible. And it's one in which it's true to the definition that we used, that effective leadership is the mobilization of other people. It's not doing everything yourself. It's enabling and empowering other people to act. And the most responsible leaders that I've come across are those that do very little apart from support and nurture and help other people to do their jobs and do their work.
I have two other questions. One is from Nareshwari.
Yes, go ahead.
How can an extremely shy person, I think she's very shy, so how can an extremely shy person build their leadership? Do we need to complete all leader qualification to be called a leader, or can we be a leader in our own way?
Yes, no, this is a really good point. And, you know, it's quite often the case where effective leadership in the modern world comes right up against our culture and our cultural traditions, where we might feel less assertive or less confident, or sometimes in a cultural setting where we feel that, you know, for many decades, we haven't had a voice that's recognized. So how do you become a leader if you're a very shy person? Well, there are two or three answers, I think, which work quite well. The first is that you surround yourself with a team, that you become a team player, and the team becomes the leader, not you as an individual. You are still influential within the team. Most shy people have very strong relationships with one or two other people. And so you bring them together and your voice becomes a shared voice with others, not just you, who might feel a bit shy or a bit lacking in confidence. The second is, I have to say, we have a wonderful ability to become someone else through social media. So you may be shy face to face. Use social media, use digital relationships to grow. When I did a study a few years ago on Facebook, I was looking at identity and how people define their identity. And I found that people, the study I did was in the United States, and I found that on average, young women between the ages of 16 and 19 had multiple Facebook profiles. I found this really astonishing. What are they doing? But it's interesting. They had one Facebook profile that they used in their high school, one that they used with their parents, and one which they used with their friends. So if you wanted to be recognized as a profile and identity with your high school, you presented yourself as a team player, as doing your homework, pictures of you being a responsible student. If you wanted a strong profile and identity with your parents, you could create a profile in which you were a loving daughter or son and a very helpful family member. Whereas with your peer group or your friends, you'd have an entirely different Facebook profile, maybe involving your nightlife or your social or your fashion preferences and so forth. So the digital world can help us adapt our profile in order to fulfill a role effectively as a leader. Some of the best leaders don't exhibit their own personal, but what is required for their role as leader. And but I think that those two issues are quite important. One is teams. You get to make sure it's a team that's managing, not an individual. And the second is you use technology to protect your lack of confidence or your lack of assertiveness. What we don't want is a world full of leaders just because they're very, very confident and bullying and they know all the answers straight away. We have to have much more subtle approaches to identifying good leadership than that.
Right. Okay, we have one more from Nicole Felicia. Okay, sometimes, well, many times when we are a leader, we cannot satisfy everyone, right? So there are some people who are not satisfied in your solutions. So if you don't find a winning solution to all stakeholders, how do you manage that?
So I referred to the importance of managing loss. So every decision that's taken will have winners and losers. It's almost impossible to envisage a situation where everybody wins. That's not the way of the world. Resources are scarce, and some people find it more difficult to change than others. So I think the answer is how much attention you pay to those who lose and how much attention you pay to those who win. And the political leaders often make the mistake in our observation that they only talk to the winners. They don't worry about the losers. The losers are a minority, or we don't worry. But actually the best leaders are those that focus on those who lose. They make the leadership decision they need to because it's inevitable, but then they manage the losses by recognizing that disequilibrium, that change brings about losses that you have to cope with. So how often do political leaders go into the community and talk to those people who are struggling with modernity, struggling with the advances? People who lose their jobs because technology changes the nature of employment. It's very hard, but the answer is managing loss is more important than managing benefits. Benefits will look after themselves.
Okay, so how much time do we have left, Pak Fadila?
We still have
Until
15.
7, is it? Is that right?
Maximum? Yeah, 15. 6:30 is maximum.
6:30. Okay. Okay. So we have we have quite a number of questions here from my students, Ronaldo Giban. Yeah. Batch 25. I would like to ask, what are the things that we should have or we should do to become a better leader in the company? So as a employee, yeah.
There's a very good starting point to this question. It's a very important question. How do you become a better leader? How do you as an individual become a leader? Well, don't think of being a leader. Think of being part of a leadership. So identify who in the company are going to be significant and important for taking the company forward, and then get together and build that as a team. If you think of it as your personal mission to become the leader, to become a better leader, you'll fail. You'll go and get qualifications, you'll learn how to do things. But at the end of the day, the most effective and successful leaders are those that enable a team to form. And the team can comprise people with all different skills, where the sum of the team is greater than the parts, what we call synergy. So you add 5 people together and they're effective like 6 or 7 because of the combination that you've got. So I think that's really important. To become a better leader of a company, step back from being a leader and step forward at being a convener, being an enabler, being somebody who mobilizes others.
All right. Here from Kalia.
Another one.
Do you still have time?
Yeah, but we have another question first from Nathaniel. Okay, from Nathaniel Bintang Mahaputra, talking about relationship, Professor Hardy. He wants to ask about how to as a fresh graduate. Okay, since most likely we know like fresh graduate is have less authority to lead. So how to enhance or develop our leadership while actually we don't have the authority yet for that.
So leading without authority is really, really hard. It's difficult, but it's important that we try and important that we do. So I think this is about the relationship you build with those who have authority. So there are those with authority and those without. Usually those with authority find it very hard to mobilize those who don't want to follow. Leaders require people to follow, and there's an art of being a strong follower. Even if you haven't the authority, if you're a strong follower, you can have influence. Now, what does a follower have to do? A follower has to be supportive but critical, has to be critical with the ability to be positive and new ideas. So those without power can, and without authority, can influence those with authority by having good and strong ideas, by having alternative ways of looking at it. It's much easier to say, no, I don't like that, than it is to say, I don't like this, why not try that? So what you do is the authority you grow by sharing experience, by sharing options and alternatives. But every time I've answered questions, it's emphasis on teams rather than individuals. And of course, individuals may have authority or not, but normally teams have a combination of people and together they will have authority, if that's helpful.
Okay, so even though actually we have less authority in a company or in a position, but at least we can start from influence our team, something like that.
And
Okay.
you know, the question, most leaders like people who knock on their door and they say, I know I'm only a humble junior, but if I were leader, this is what I'd do. Why not try this? Okay. And then make suggestions, be positive, in other words. There's a really good question about culture and tradition and about diversity that's come from, is it Bernardos? That's a really interesting question. And I know within Indonesia, you have such wonderful diversity, as we do here in the UK. And so with the question is about, with so much diversity of culture and tradition and religion, how can we manage to lead one another? It's very complex. And it's a challenge. You know, some people would argue, I certainly am one person who argues that the biggest challenge we have in our contemporary world is how we live with difference, how we get on with people who are not the same age, gender, religion, nationality, language, color, you know, all the differences that we have in our rich tapestry of life. And how do we lead when we have such diversity? Well, your national identity does this very well. What happened when the Indonesian state became independent? You took your 300 tribes and your many hundred languages, your huge complex archipelago of many communities, and you developed your unity in diversity. You developed an approach to managing your nation by celebrating diversity and focusing on common ground. So the unity isn't easy, but it actually comes from common ground. And your remarkable Pancasila and the way in which you develop a secular relationship that is able to absorb diversity is a role model for many other countries. No other country has this tradition. Quite apart from your leaders who went to find a new language which everyone would share. This is a remarkable success. So Bahasa Indonesia becomes a common language for all Indonesians. And by referring to your own experience in your nation state, you can begin to see the strategies that you need to manage with diverse workforces or in diverse communities. It's about inclusion. It's about establishing common ground. It's about saying that we have more in common than exists that distinguishes us, or there where we have indifference, much more in common. And that requires, of course, a moderation, a tolerance of other people's views, all that are important for nation building, but they're equally important for leadership and effective leadership. So we have to also have very clear rules and regulations about discrimination and how we should not accept that somebody would be disadvantaged because of their age, because of their ethnicity, because of their faith, because of their language or whatever. These are very difficult things. They require a spirit of cooperation and a regulatory framework that fights discrimination. But great question. Thank you very much. don't underestimate the power that Indonesia should have on the world stage at showing other countries how successfully it manages its diversity.
Okay, thank you, Professor Hardy. For Sir Rizal, is there anything from your students? More question, perhaps, for our
Yes.
closing statement?
Yes, sure. Okay, we have from Kaila Hanifa. I would like to ask, does everyone can become a leader? How do we, this is from Laura, sorry. Does everyone can become a leader? How do we balance it on our personal life?
This is almost impossible, and I'm a very bad person to ask. As you would speak to my wife and family, they never see me. And one of the problems of being a leader is that you extend your responsibility to many other people, not just to your family or your local community. And that's a decision you must take about the contribution you make. So if you choose to make a contribution beyond your family as a leader of others, then you must make that decision openly, and you must discuss it with those who need you and those who are part of your immediate responsibility. But you have to do that, however, because somebody needs to step up and make a contribution beyond their own family and their own community. We need you to be influential in the world, to be leading in companies, to be politically active, because actually this is an age of collaboration. It's an age of cooperation. And that requires us to sometimes step up from the safety of our own family and community into the broader scenario. You know, I've led now for the last 10 years a very significant research center at Coventry University. We have, nearly 300 people working, both academics and PhD scholars, and it's a huge responsibility. But we wouldn't have it if somebody hadn't said, we must do this together. Of course, you do it collectively and you do it collegiately, and you create collaborations which keep you sane. Being a leader doesn't replace your responsibility with your friends and family. It adds to that responsibility.
Yeah. Sometimes when you're at the work, you're the leader, you're the big boss, and when you come back home, your wife becomes the leader. So
exactly.
Okay, so another one from Kyla. How you measure success of a leader?
I think we measure success in leadership by what is achieved, not who they are or whether they're friendly or whether they're everybody's best mate or best friend. What do they achieve? And you focus on the objectives. So you're responsible for leading even your own personal private life. You have to be a leader of yourself. So set an objective, achieve that objective, and then evaluate how you did it and whether it was effective or not. And that extends upwards. So we measure leaders by what they do, not what they say.
Okay, one more, I think last one from my student. I think it's very important question. I like this one. Sometimes a leader need to make a decision very fast. And sometimes the decision has to have a very complex understanding. How do you think a good leader will think and act? You need a sudden and a complex decision.
Yeah, so this is more common than we think, that leaders are often put under huge pressure to make decisions very quickly, particularly with the pace of change that's taking place nowadays. I think the answer to the question is, how willing are you to accept the mistakes that you make? How open are you to the fact that you will make mistakes? I think the best leaders take decisions quickly, but watch the consequences of the decisions and are quite happy to say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, we have to change. Too many leaders, bad leaders, make a decision and stick with it and say they were right, irrespective. And they are not able to be humble enough to say that they're human like everybody else. If you go into a decision saying, I'm going to do my best. Support me. I recognize there's a risk that we might not be correct, but we're going to do the best we can. On the best advice, we're going to listen and take the best decision we can. We might not get it right. Then you're more likely to be a successful leader, even making errors. How? Because your followers will say, this is a person who learns by their mistakes and who knows that they make mistakes and who acknowledges that it's not getting the decision right, it's taking the best decision you can at that point in time. And it might be the wrong decision, but if you're humble and recognize that you can make mistakes, your followers will respect you.
Okay, well, I think one more. Can I have one more from Shireen here?
Okay,
How can a leader respond to criticism?
So it's not many leaders like criticism, of course. And, it's very hard. But I think responding to criticism is always ask, when you're challenged, ask the question, how would you do it? What could I have done differently? Instead of simply listening to, you're wrong, you're bad, you've made the wrong decision, always push back and say, okay, what would you have done? What should I have done differently? Can we do it differently next time? And, but actually always respect criticism as long as it's constructive. If it's very negative and if it's not very friendly, then you can just ignore it. But if it's constructive, you need to embrace it and accept it, I think. Very, very hard.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Sarizal and the students for the questions. Okay.
Thank you all very much. It's been a real pleasure talking with you all. And I'm very sorry about my outage. My electricity went off and on, but we're back anyway. We had a good session. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Hadi, and also Sarizal and another students. Thank you also for International Relations Office. Now we please for the International Office for the closing statement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for Mr. Fadil for moderating the sessions today. Thank you so much. And also to Mr. Mose Rizal, thank you so much, sir, for attending our session. And also a really grateful thank you for Prof. Mike Hardy in the UK. Thank you so much, Prof. Mike Hardy, to giving your time to discuss with LSPR here today, this morning and this afternoon. And before we end our session for today, I would like to request for all participants to open up their camera so we could take a picture together before we end for today's session with Prof. Mike Hardy.
Okay, excuse me, but actually this is I have another one last, but this is very important. I think 1 minute only, please, Professor Hardy. Can? Okay. Yeah, this question also lucky you, Sir Rizal, your students quite active, while my students only one. My students only one question. Okay, sir, Professor Hardy, is how to separate professionalism, leadership, and friendship? Because somehow in the office, right, when we are appointed as a leader in the management, and somehow we also have a friend or we make a connection with the staff, but we treat them as a friends. How to separate them to avoid the conflict of interest, ideally, at least? Your suggestion, please.
So it's about being transparent and open. When I became a leader, I didn't lose all my friends. That would be terrible. But it's actually being very open and honest. Sometimes we hide our friendships because we think there's a conflict of interest, but actually we must declare our friendships, be very open. And when you're open, people will see that you're honest and that you recognize the conflict might exist. So it's about being transparent, I think, is the answer to that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Before I back to International Office with Miss Heidi.
So we have all your cameras off so we can have a nice picture.
Please, yes, please turn it on, and also please fill your registration link. Okay, please open up the camera for all students. Show us your base smile.
We have 3 slides. Please give your best smile because I think Prof might also want to see your beautiful and handsome faces here in LSPR. Okay, the first page first. Please give your best smile. 1, 2, and 3. Please smile. Okay, next page. Okay, we have 4 pages now. Okay, the second page now. 1, 2, and 3. Please give your best smile. Okay, the third page. 1, 2, and 3. Please smile. Okay, last but not the least, the fourth page. 1, 2, and 3. Please smile, please. Okay, thank you so much for today, for the lecturer, for Mr. Moshe Rizal, Mr. Fadil, and also Prof. Mike Hardy.
Thank you very much.
Today. And hope to see you soon here in Jakarta, or hope to see you soon in the UK, Prof. And thank you so much for the Londoners. Hope to see you again next week. And don't forget, we still have the session with Prof. Mike Hardy. We'll be discussing about the crisis communications in 19th of November. 19th of November, yes. So thank you so much. Have a nice day ahead.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day. Be prepared for mid examination coming soon. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Fadila.
Thank you, Sir Rizal.